Welcome to Office Hours. I'm your host, Tomasz Tunguz. This is a program where we invite luminaries from all over the startup world to share their insights. It's a unique format in that we gather questions from attendees ahead of time and then weave them into the conversation. And we also have founders and executives ask questions along the way. They've been a huge success. I think this is the 10th one that we've done. Thank you to everybody who registered for this event. We've gathered questions from more than 600 people. The format of the session is Lee and I will be having a conversation for about 30 to 35 minutes, fireside chat, and then we'll open it up directly to questions from the audience. Please use the questions feature, the Q&A feature at the bottom of Zoom to ask those questions. I'll be monitoring them. We are recording this session, and so only share stuff that you wouldn't mind if it's published. Today I have the great pleasure of welcoming Lee Kirkpatrick to Office Hours. Lee is no stranger to managing a company through turbulence and to terrific success. He joined Twilio at 15 million in ARR, grew the company to $1 billion. He was involved in every venture financing, crossover rounds, IPOs, secondary, convertible debt. He was part of a team that helped acquire 5 companies along the way, and I would argue is one of the foremost experts in usage-based pricing, having grown one of the most successful startups with that model. Before Twilio, he was COO, CFO at Say Media, where he navigated the global financial crisis. And before that, he was CFO at Ofoto, which he helped grow to 150 million before selling to Kodak, having lived through the dotcom crash. Lee, thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights. We're thrilled to have you here.
No, it's great to be here, and really appreciate the community you're building with these calls and with your blog. So it's my pleasure.
Awesome. So we'll cover 2 main topics that emerged from the audience questions today. The first is usage-based pricing, and then the second is managing through a downturn. We'll cover them in that order. So let's jump in, and don't be shy on the questions. So usage-based pricing. Usage-based pricing is the practice of charging customers by consumption. Twilio mastered this billing system. Lee, you saw it firsthand. Can you tell us a bit about how it evolved? I mean, I remember seeing the Series A pitch for Twilio, and it was new.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. Usage-based pricing, one, it was not popular with investors at the time, and it was quite new. There really weren't billing systems or models or metrics around it. When Twilio started evolving this, the term product-led growth, which is common now, was new. The definitions for ARR did not include usage-based pricing. So it was a new, it was a new frontier for us. But it's what made sense for our business and what our customers needed.
And tell me more about that. Like, what was it within the customer base that made Twilio decide that usage-based pricing was the right fit?
Yeah, there's a few elements, and certainly, and you alluded to talked about this in the link in the blog post. But cost structure was important from day one. We had a communications-based business. We billed by the minute or by the message. And so it was very important for us to align our costs with our revenue structure. So that was a key piece of it. But I think as importantly was our customer base, the developer customer base. These were not people that were ready to sign up large upfront contracts. They were experimenting, they were building at the time, and we needed something low friction, flexible, easy for them to come on board, use the product, try it, and get it going without a big upfront financial commitment.
Got it. Okay, so you hit on 2 key points there. The first one is you really want to grease the wheels so that developers can sign up, and so there's not a big initial cost. And the second one was Twilio was bought minutes from carriers and other sort of components of telephony, and then so they had a significant cost structure, and so you wanted to make sure you never got into a place where the pricing didn't make sense for Twilio, where the gross margin wasn't as strong as it could have been. Is that right?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, if you think of classic subscription businesses, just like the health club gym model, right? If you have a gymnasium, a few people are going to come in and use all the equipment and wear it out. They're going to make a lot of money on people that don't come very often. So that type of subscription model can work with a lot of businesses. It would not work well if you have a very high cost like the underlying communication services we had at Twilio.
Got it. Okay, fascinating. And so when you joined Twilio at 15, right? Grew $1 billion, which is an incredible run. What changed with usage-based pricing along the way, if anything?
I think as we scaled the business, the fundamental tenets did stay the same. So that low friction, get customers on board easily so they could use and try the service. That stayed with us when we were dealing with, the early customers. We had Airbnb, Uber, Lyft when they were just small companies. That actually worked as we started selling into enterprises. And, we had many cases where we'd be selling into a large bank, be part of an RFP process, competing with some big, well-established companies. Meanwhile, the actual developers at the bank, they were using Twilio on their credit cards. So they were using us. They were kicking around, kicking the tires, and liking the service. So while we're going through the RFP process, we were already being used. So that paid off even for these large enterprise deals. And when we had our enterprise sales teams later on, as the product evolved and we had a product, Twilio Flex, which was more customer support, the same tenet of this low friction paid off and made the enterprise sales definitely made those processes simpler and more effective.
Fascinating. Okay. And as the company moved up market, and you started to introduce contracts, that's a new construct, right? Because I imagine, or some of the kind of challenge with usage-based pricing is that customers are afraid of what they might pay that first month, like the shock.
Yeah.
How did Twilio manage that? How did you negotiate that?
Yeah, and I see, just to take a step back, one of the other important use cases where usage-based pricing is very important is if the customer's usage is not consistent. So if it's intermittent, if it's highly seasonal, if they have bursts, it doesn't make sense for the customer to lock into a fixed monthly subscription fee because they're not going to get value for it. And the usage base can be aligned with their expense. So that was important. The type of contracts we evolved to were really, which worked well for our business, and I've seen work well in other ones, were 12-month contracts, maybe 24-month contracts with fixed minimum commitments. But the minimum commitment would be less than what a customer would use. So if a customer was spending $7,000 a month at our basic list pricing, we would have a sales rep and say, hey, sign up for $5,000 a month, and we'll take your $7,000, we'll go to $6,000, but commit to $5,000. Get a better price, but commit for that amount per month over 12 months. And that was highly effective. It saved money for most of our customers. And most of them were over that level, so they weren't paying an overage fee. And then there was, from a go-to-market standpoint, there was an extremely valuable piece of that where it allowed our sales team a great excuse to reach out to our customers and say, hey, you're paying $7,000 a month. I can get your bill down to $6,000.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, are there any other use cases we can sell to you? Or, hey, you're using Twilio Voice. We have this great SMS service. So it was a really great way to stay in contact with the customers and provide them value and obviously get commitments from our end.
Fascinating. So you would undersell, you would undersize the contract relative to their spend in order to make sure that you had consistent touch points and you could always kind of come back and then basically grow the account. So by undersizing it, you're kind of juicing the NDR in a sense, right?
Yeah, you absolutely. It supported your expansion rate, and it also just led to a much better customer experience. In that same case, if an overzealous sales rep had sold the customer on $10,000 a month, and they're at that $7,000, the customer is just not going to be happy in terms of the long term. So in the short term, there might be an opportunity to get a little more from the customer. But in the long term, the customer is happy. We have the touch point, and you're exactly right. That is one of the reasons Twilio had a very fine customer revenue expansion rate, certainly over my term, which continues to today.
Incredible. Okay, got it. And so usage-based pricing, like you said, it was rare, right? It was rare, or it was unusual. AWS kind of had it, but we really didn't see very many startups at the time. It must have meant like, internally and externally, things changed for you, right? So like the billing systems and how you created invoices, like how did that work?
Yeah, that certainly was a lot of work. So there was nothing off the shelf at the time. So we did have our homegrown billing system to support the huge amount of transactions that we supported. So the billing system was probably one of the key items to keep up with that business. Across the operations, how you worked with the sales team, sales and marketing, commission plans. There was really no playbook for that. So that all evolved also as we grew. But a lot of it, again, we were doing it for the first time. We had some guidance from AWS. Our head of sales had come from AWS, so that was very helpful. But that you're dead on right. That was about it.
And then, let's double click on the sales teams and commissions, right? Sales teams are kind of like the Salesforce model had been around at least a decade by that point. Everybody was kind of trained on the 12-month annual upfront, right? With, 5-to-1 quote at OTE. And then you're hiring an AE, right? And you're trying to do a commission plan. Like, how did it work? How did you convince them this was the right thing?
You're right. It's very hard because that's the sales rep comes in and says, "Hey, great, I'm going to make, in that time, $200,000 a year, and I need to bring in $1 million a year of contracted revenue," and that's what they were used to seeing. And we could not replicate that structure. How we went about it. First of all, that also was a very evolutionary process, working very closely with the sales team, but we kind of reverse engineered it and said, okay, we have a top performing sales rep. We need to pay them $200,000 for doing stuff that makes us happy in general, that supports the business. And, so we broke into pieces. And the first piece we came up was kind of what I talked earlier in terms of getting the contractual commitments. We said, hey, we have people using the service pay as you go. And if we want to get X amount per month, maybe 5, 10 per month into contracts. And if you get those people contracted, we're going to pay you. So there was a little bit of going out on faith on our end, like that this was going to add value. We modeled it and thought it would add value because of the expansion rate. So we had very different models. So you're right. So you're telling a sales rep, hey, instead of 1.2 million of contracted quota, we need you to sign people to eight commitments per month over a year, and then you'll get paid. So that was the initial model.
Fascinating. Okay, and then how did NDR work? Like, were reps credited on NDR? Like, if the account expanded within the first 12 months?
We did. There's initially it was just bring people over the finish line, sign the commitment. We decided we were happy. We did have an account management team. That went after the appropriate transition, the account management team would have a contracted revenue base, and they would get paid on growing the base. And again, there was some complexities on that, as I talked about, because the more when you sign someone to a higher commitment, by definition, the ARR or annual recurring revenue or monthly recurring revenue will drop during that time period. So it also took a lot of sales management to make sure people were doing the right thing, because, the right thing in a lot of cases is to take the revenue down in the short term.
Interesting. Oh, yeah. I see. Yeah. Like you said, going back to the seasonality, right? If you contracted a customer and they had a big spike, you wouldn't want to make sure the customer was happy throughout the year.
Yep.
Makes sense. Okay, cool. Awesome. Okay. Was there this dynamic of people having these big shock bill, CFO calling an AE and saying this is 10 times as much as I would have wanted to spend? How did you manage that?
Great question, because being a CFO, that's your worst nightmare, is someone coming into your office. And I'm not going to name the vendors, but there's some well-known vendors that I've worked with that people on this call would know, where I've had someone from our technology team come in and say, hey, by the way, we didn't get the bill right, and it's far, far greater than we think. And especially as a public company CFO, when that can impact your earnings, that doesn't leave for a good day. We did have a few cases of that, but we did closely monitor usage. So we were watching usage daily. So if we saw something spike, we would definitely get out and ahead of it and try to reach out and talk to the customer. And there were a few cases where customers, for whatever reason, you periodically even see a fraud case. We got very good at shutting fraud down, but if there was abnormal usage, their product took off in a certain way, we would reach out to them really quickly to avoid that.
Makes sense. Awesome. Okay, Luke has a question about going back to the minimum commitment in those sales contracts. He asks, as Twilio evolved, how did the minimum commit and price increases change over time? And like as you added more products, did the base level of commitment increase?
No, not really. No, I mean, we had levels, the smallest amount was 1,000 a month, and we had increments 5, 10, 20, 25,000. So that stayed the same. And as we brought on more products and more features, that just helped people reach a higher level of commitment and get a lower volume price.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, cool. Thanks for that question, Luke. Okay, cool. Okay. Raising capital with a sort of like with a usage-based model where it's kind of ARR, but kind of not. Like, how did you negotiate that? Did you talk about like the fraction of ARR that was committed? Did you have to make sort of projections on what you thought the ARR would be?
Yeah, we did it. We did get the model to be highly predictable. And so you're right. At that time, usage-based revenue was not considered ARR, but we looked really closely, again, at our revenue churn rate, our revenue expansion rates, our customer churn rate, customer expansion rate. So we showed highly consistent revenue. And, we had some of the stats that I would talk about both privately and publicly was, in the calendar, for the next calendar year, the Q4 revenue, 80% of the revenue is going to come from existing customers. So people could be comfortable that even though we didn't have committed contracts, we had a history that the revenue is going to be predictable and consistent. So it was really about showing that, hey, there was not a high revenue churn. In our case, it was less than 5%. And then the expansion rate was up over 130%. So that got people very consistent. So we kind of modeled and created an ARR number off of that.
Yeah. So you had enough predictable behavior to get to a place where you got very confident in what you thought was going to happen. You'd seen enough years to see the seasonality and understood different parts of the company.
Yeah, the seasonality, and then really understanding our cohorts of customers when we got new customers, running histograms on the customers, looking at the cohorts. Typically you would have a few large customers in a cohort, and that could lead. And if we had a cohort that didn't have it, that would push us in large customers push us in a different direction. A lot of modeling by a terrific team. Yes.
Makes sense. Okay. A follow-up question here from the audience. Naga asks, how did you present the ARR MRR? Did you call all of the revenue ARR, or just a contracted part when you were fundraising?
Everything was presented as MRR, ARR. In fact, the contracted part was well under 50% of the total revenue.
Wow. Okay. Incredible. Great question, Naga. Thanks. Let's see. Okay. I'm just trying to process these questions in real time. Cool. Okay. So I've watched a handful of our startups wrestle with the migration from a SaaS billing model to usage-based pricing. And one of the questions pricing teams, they kind of create these, within the startups, they create these pricing teams to go and figure out what should the pricing strategy be. Sure, something like that happened with you at Twilio. And the most common issue they face is defining the thing that they were going to charge on. Like, what is the unit of use to charge on, right? At Twilio, you had minutes and messages, which was very straightforward because that was tied to your costs. But as you think about it, would you have any recommendations for other startups on what that core unit ought to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things, having come from Twilio, I get calls on this, and if I think back, some of the companies I'm on the board of or I've been advising, I get pulled into the usage-based world a lot, no surprise, and it can vary. A company I'm working with or worked with last year, Marqeta, who went public, they have the modern credit card issuing and payment platform. They just have a small percentage of every payment transaction, so it's just the payment transaction. Another great company I've had the fortune of working with, Olo, which provides a SaaS platform for restaurants. So helping restaurants do the ordering, they have the mix model, which we haven't talked about. So they have the platform fee, you pay a SaaS charge per restaurant, and then for every order or every delivery, they make a small transaction fee. And maybe I'll jump into another one, Spreedly, where I sit on the board, which is a company that has a payment orchestration platform. It's kind of like a Twilio for payments almost. almost. So if you're a merchant and you want to access multiple payment providers like Adyen or Braintree or Stripe, you can just plug into Spreedly, and then they optimize and route to the right person. And again, that's on every transaction they route. And that, by the way, that leads to a point we didn't get into, is that kind of ties in also where the transaction model can get extremely valuable, where your success helps your customer's success. So in the case of Spreedly, they optimize routing for payments, so more transactions go through for merchants. The fail rate goes down. They also take care of PCI compliance and other stuff. So if you have that on their platform, your revenue is going to go up, transactions grow up, and you'll be successful. And we saw that at Twilio, right? Even if you think of Uber in the early days, one of the early Twilio clients, if you didn't have that texting, anonymous texting platform, anonymous voice on Uber, that product would have been not nearly as useful. So as Uber grew and was successful, Twilio also shared in that success, and our product effort, innovation effort actually contributed to both. So you had this virtuous cycle.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that idea of tying your success to your customer success. I mean, that's really what you're after with usage-based pricing.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And, one comment that too, and you've got to be very sure that you've got differentiation and great product features, and you'll continue to improve the platform. We aspired and modeled ourselves after AWS, which continually got better and better and better. Because if you don't do that right, the customer is going to take a look and say, well, I can just do this on my own. Why should I, as I scale significantly, why should I keep paying you more? So it puts a lot of onus on your product set.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Okay, Wes and Millen have two related questions, which was, with usage-based pricing, you've got a lot of volatility, right? You might have seasonality in different parts of the customer base. You've got to forecast through that. Did you do anything actively in order to minimize that volatility? Like, would the sales team go and find two different verticals who might have offset seasonality, or would you do any kind of, or did you just take it as it came?
Yeah, I mean, more the latter. I mean, fortunately, we did push to be in multiple markets, because you might have a travel and hospitality market. And in fact, if I look at Twilio, during after I left during the COVID crisis, right, travel hospitality goes way down, but telehealth, shoots way up. So I think it's just a product about having a broad customer base, which is very helpful.
Makes sense. Okay, awesome. Okay, let's keep going here. So, okay, we see, like you mentioned, right? Twilio was based on the Twilio sales model took a lot of influence from AWS, and we see usage-based pricing in a lot of infrastructure companies, a lot of open source companies that take open source software and then commercialize it. And it makes sense, right, to the point that you made before, Lee, that engineers want to start small and then they'll grow and then they'll bring it into their business. They might bring it into a big bank. Do you foresee usage-based pricing getting into other categories like classic software? Could you see CRM being sold on a usage-based pricing model or other big categories?
Boy, that's a great question. I think I would go back to that checklist, of cost model. Is it good for the customer? Actually, I'll give you an example. I could see it. Example, if I go back to when I was at, say, media, and this isn't usage-based pricing, but this is going back well over 10 years. We were looking at analytic and visualization tools. And one of the options, I'm not going to name the company because it didn't work out. And the other one was Tableau. And Tableau was in at low friction. It was low cost. And I forget what the annual fee was. It was not very much. And this other company, which actually had a better solution, wanted the big upfront fee in the contract. And I was negotiating with them as the CFO. And next thing I knew, we had like 30 users, because it all came in under the authorization approval level. And the company had a few hundred people. There's like 30, 35 users of Tableau. And I'm negotiating with this other company, for like a light site license and all of that. So that formed a lot of my thinking on the low friction. So I do think there probably is some opportunity if there's some wall or gate for people to get in with this type of pricing. And then you follow up, right, with the professional sales team once it's already in.
Yeah, you're right. It really is all about, I guess what you're saying is like, it's much more about reducing the friction and getting usage
Yeah.
inside of the company so that way Tableau is sort of part of the business, and it's going to be harder for somebody else to come
Yeah.
and unseat them. And if the pricing model helps you get there, then that's a good thing, but it doesn't, don't force it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think some products probably lend themselves to it. And there's probably other products where you do need that big, heavy upfront enterprise sales effort. But that's tough, especially, especially there's probably a lot of early stage venture companies on here, and that's tough to do early on.
Totally. Okay, awesome. We're at the halfway point. So I'm going to ask you a transition question that's going to go from usage-based pricing into market volatility.
Okay.
And actually, a caller, so to speak, also asked the same question, which is usage-based pricing. Like you said, Twilio, less than 50% of the revenue is coming in contract. And now, looks like we're in a recession. The multiples are way off, down 60 to 70% in the public markets. Maybe we see, less consumption in the market. Is a usage-based pricing model more volatile as a result in market conditions that look like this?
I think that is a great question. By definition, you'll have more volatility in the usage base. As we talked about, if you have a broad customer base, that can definitely mitigate it. I think the real question is, if you have your subscription-based model, certainly in the short term, you're going to have more protection on the pricing. If someone scales back and they don't have the users, all that, but you're certainly not going to be supporting your customer and having your customer in any favor. And when that contract comes up, almost a weakened customer will be renewing. In the subscription-based model, it is what your customer needs and what your customer wants. And if their usage goes down, they're paying for what they use, and you support them and adjust your cost structure appropriately. So I think in the long term, it really shouldn't have any impact. Certainly in a 12-month period, it could during the aspect. But I think providing value to your customer, supporting them, I think that in the longer term is going to be better off than having someone locked in on a contract. So, and again, that's if it's the right model for you and your customer.
Yeah. And it is also, you can't look at a 12-month contract as ironclad either. I remember during COVID, I was working with one software company, and COVID came, and a handful of their customers really struggled as a result. And if they can't pay, or if they don't want to pay, like, you're not going to sue them, right? You can't force them to pay. And
yeah, they've got market power. If they can't pay on the contract, they're in the driver's seat, sadly. Yeah.
Right. Okay, cool. Okay, so you've been through many cycles, ups and downs, V-shaped recoveries, not so V-shaped recoveries. I'm curious, a lot of the conversations that we're having in boardrooms today, like VCs and management teams, are the economic environment is changing. Let's take a look at our cash and our runway, and let's start thinking about how we lengthen our runway. Can you talk a little bit and share your experiences of what that transition should feel like? How does the culture of a startup, or like the operating discipline of a startup, need to evolve as we enter into a recession?
Yeah, it's a great question, and obviously no one size fits all. But I do think the baseline is right. We've had cheap capital for many years, and I think the baseline assumption is that capital is not going to be as available as cheap, certainly in the near term. So, from an evolution thinking standpoint, you're always thinking about product market fit and sales efficiency, revenue efficiency as a startup, and what level to invest. You've certainly written about it many times. I think that importance is certainly amplified, right, when capital is tight. So I think from the startup standpoint of understanding culturally, like, hey, do we really have the fit we want in terms of product market investment at a certain point? And then how efficient are we in terms of sales and marketing becomes very important. And I think where you stand on that spectrum, right, you're going to dial up or dial down and look at your cost structure moving forward. So, and that I think that just becomes extra important in a period of tight capital.
Makes sense. One of the pieces of advice I've seen floating around is you should scenario plan. You should have let's get to cash flow break even, make sure the company can survive no matter what, right? With probably significant layoffs. There's like a base level plan of conservative growth, and then there's a pedal to the metal plan. Did you, like when you were running a business, did you do that kind of scenario planning?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I'll tell you, my first experience in a recessionary environment was when I was at Reuters America in the early 90s, and I just gotten a big promotion to be a Southeast divisional manager, and I was all excited. Welcome to the operation. Recession, you have to do layoffs. So it was definitely a trial by fire. We actually did not do that. We did the layoffs, and we just did not think through what would happen next. And that experience really sat with me. But I think running the scenario planning and looking to see, thinking, wait a minute, we're playing to win. Sure, you're playing to survive early on, but in the long term, you're playing to win. So in later cases, we did do that and said, hey, here's where we're at. And when we see things opening up, here's where we want to invest. And I think that is a great best practice.
Okay. And in those scenario planning, one of the things that I've seen, and I'm sure you have, is like one of the first buckets to get cut is marketing program spend. It tends to be sort of the easiest thing to cut just because it's like, okay, ads or events or whatever it is. And I was chatting with a marketer. I was like on Twitter a couple of weeks ago about this, and she asked me, "Is this really the wisest thing to do? Because you're cutting off medium-term pipe, right? Like, yeah, you get the short-term efficiency, but you're really going to see a medium-term pipeline hit." What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I do have a strong opinion. It's interesting. So, which might be a different perspective from yours as an investor, but from the operator perspective, I see that perspective. If there is good product market fit, and if you're growing, and if unit economics, in terms of whether it's customer acquisition cost, whether either an enterprise standpoint or a online direct standpoint, if it's paying off, I would be very reluctant to do that. And if I had my series of options, I would be out talking to my banks, in terms of debt line, taking loans against recurring revenue. I would be certainly talking to my inside investors. And as a operator within the company, I would rather take dilution, take capital at terms that I don't like, than give up on good growth, good unit economics and sale. Because, having done 5 venture-backed companies, when you get revenue and momentum, it's valuable, it's magic. And when it's just really hard to do. So to cut that way, give up share on good unit economics. Now, the corollary, of course, if you were funding your business with cheap capital without great unit economics, then sure, scale it back. But but when I was at Video Egg Say Media, for instance, we felt our product was good enough, so we slowed down the product roadmap, heavy performance management, did not add engineering, but we focused. We kept our sales team going.
Fascinating. Okay, that's another model. Okay. Sarah asks a good question. I mean, you've been through 5 venture-backed startups, and your first promotion had a layoff. She asks, how do you get your team behind this? Doing more with less when the culture is, that the startups is trying to bring to life is a healthy work-life balance. Today, one of my management team members asked, how do I present this to the team without them just seeing it as work more?
Yeah. By the way, boy, another example on like how not to do things informs what to do. So if I do go back to that experience at Reuters, where I was a divisional finance manager, we got an edict from New York, the 52nd floor, Midtown Manhattan, saying, you need to cut back, and here's where you need to cut back. By the way, they did it twice, which of course is the no-no. You want to do it once and first. So, and the takeaway, not being part of the process, not being empowered is not great. So this is kind of obvious, but in my experience, having had to do this during the dot-com and Great Recession afterwards, engaging your team in the process early. Again, it sounds obvious. Getting them on board, being part of the process, giving the input just makes all the difference there. So if they're part of the solution, and I know a lot of times people don't like to go levels down because they're worried about things being leaking, or that, hey, the company might have a cash balance position as a challenge. But I do think transparency and involving as many people as possible, certainly in my experience, has been what's been very helpful.
Yeah, that's great advice. Really great, and a great question. Okay, let's see. Okay, how do you forecast accurately in a recession? This is a complicated question, right? Because we've seen like all these publicly traded cloud companies like Oracle and Salesforce, like beat and raise. And what ends up happening in a recession is like if you have demand destruction, all of a sudden sales cycles slow, renewals are less, the upsells are smaller, and it sort of kind of cascades on itself, right? I mean, it's sort of compounding effects. I guess you've been in the seat before. What signals are you looking for, either in the business or in the market, to tell you, hey, we should slow down, or we should be a bit more cautious about continuing to invest? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it earlier with this. The scenario planning is all you can do, like looking at your base case, low case, good case, and really watching that. It's less a question about forecasting, but I also feel operating rigor in these environments is far more important. Again, the old cliche, or the high tide, everyone floats. When the tide comes down, all the rocks are exposed, going forward. And that's what happens in a recession. So forecasting, operating the plan, tight cash management through these processes, and then really looking at your metrics, in terms of pipe and, win-loss rate and conversion rates, expansion rates, all the stuff. Again, that's always important. Yeah. But let's face it, when capital is cheap and you're in high growth, you don't have to get that perfect and you're going to be fine. So I think kind of the rigor to doing the things we know doing, you just have to follow that and track that. And, things will turn around, and just be ready so you can be there maybe a few months ahead of your competition.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, it's really all about discipline and understanding those metrics. Okay, last question for me, and then we'll transition to open Q&A. Instacart recently marked down their own shares about 30 to 35% using a 409A. Part of this has to do with ensuring that employees' new grants are above water. Yeah. And there's an open question in the startup community, like, should you do this sort of as a matter of course? Your 409A is coming up. Public market comps are off 50 to 75%. Should you mark down your 409A? Sort of, what does it mean? What does it imply? What do you have to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it would depend on where you are. Some companies, your 409A or your common might be 30% of preferred. Other cases, it might be 80 or 90%, right? So it's gonna depend on the markdown is. And I've had to do this before. I think if it's close, right? For argument's sake, let's say your 409A is at 25% of your total preferred price. And it was it was a while ago, you might be able to get away without changing that price. My view is, obviously the options are the incentive to get great people, keep them on board, and facing reality is important. So I think all other things being equal, making the adjustment so you can hire quality people and retain your people makes sense. So there's various ways you can do it. You can mark it down, you can cancel, reissue, invest shares for people, a lot of mechanics, probably too much weeds for this call. But I think facing reality and lowering it makes a lot of sense, to lock people in. One experience I had when I was at Ofoto, we had been acquired by Kodak at the time, and the economy was terrible, and we did not we had some lock-in mechanisms, but those went away. And as the economy started booming again, we had this company with great engineers, product people. We started getting picked off by Facebook and Google as those companies were growing. So you can get kind of what's the word, complacent in a poor market, right? No one has any choice.
Yeah.
But I've experienced it when it starts coming back. You want to have those lock-in retention mechanisms. So, and that would support biting the bullet on the 49A, taking some pain to protect yourself going forward.
Interesting. So it's like a proactive defensive move to protect your employees when things do come back.
Yeah. You don't need it now, but there's a good. If you don't have it, you're gonna pay the price.
Awesome. Okay. Cool. Fantastic. Those are all the questions I collected from the audience. Okay, so ahead of time, so let's jump in. Okay, this is a question for you, for Lee. What is the difference between, from a up and coming star in the valley, what is the difference between a good CFO and a great CFO in your mind? And how would you interview? Like if you had two candidates, right? What question would you ask in order to figure out who's good and who's great?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I haven't thought about this before. I think a great CFO is going to, wake up every day and be thinking about the company's overall vision, strategy, and tactics, and how is the company spending its resources and its money to achieve those, and to achieve that strategy, tactics, vision, and always have that lens. And I've worked for finance managers that have thought that way, and I've worked at other ones that are just very tactical, thinking about the actual finance function. So I think that's the first one. And I think the second one, if I was interviewing for a CFO, I would want to hear them talking about how do they interact with sales and marketing. How are they going to create and add value to that business, interact with those people? And same thing on the product side. Do they have an appreciation and understanding of the product roadmap and product investment process? So those would be some filters. If that was not part of the conversation, if it was just about accounting and fundraising and forecasting and the budget, I would be a little cautious.
That sounds like a VPF, right? VP Finance more than a CFO.
Yeah.
And you, Lee, you had this title a few times, which is CFO, COO. What did that mean? Like when you got those additional three letters at the end of your title? Yeah.
Certainly, double hatting with two roles was not a good idea. By the way, I'll say that on this call. The CFO job, I think, is pretty well defined in terms of what you do. The CEO job, I always define it as you do things the CEO doesn't want to do. But in those cases, I did pick up much more operations. So in one case, in both cases, actually, I actually had develop product and development, and then all the operations aspects of the company, and then on top of finance. And in retrospect, when I look back on my career, I don't think it was a good idea, because I think it's very hard to be in the detail of operations, worried about executing a product roadmap. If I go back to say media, worried about our ad campaigns coming through, at the same time thinking strategically about M&A, and going back to that comment I just made, thinking about, hey, is the company moving in the direction to drive the strategy? Because the CFO is the one that knows they know the numbers, the money, the spent better than everyone. And I almost felt being involved in the heavy operations distracted me from that strategically. And so that learning, I certainly applied at Twilio just to focus on the CFO role.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a brilliant insight. The way I think about like the CFO, really great CFOs, they kind of, great structures are built in tension. Like you look at the Golden Gate Bridge, it's a tension bridge. And what I've seen is great CFOs like you're you hold a company to account in a lot of ways, right? You think about like the deal desk or the sales finance team and making sure the contracts are structured right, making sure the business doesn't isn't carrying too great costs, and asking the really tough questions. And so I can see in your answer, like if you're doing both things, it's sort of hard to maintain that tension, right? And notwithstanding the amount of time that you have to commit to doing more work. So
yeah, that's a great observation. I haven't thought about that way, but yeah, I totally agree. If you're losing sleep, if there is downtime for your system and customers are angry and you're dealing with that, again, it's very hard to cover some of the stuff you're talking about, thinking about, hey, how does it best support the sales team or keep them in line? You're dead on.
Okay, awesome. Okay, cool. Now we're going to jump around a little bit here with different questions. So Akshay asked, how often did you review and modify pricing and packaging? Was it an annual thing, quarterly thing?
How often did we review it? Boy, it was almost a continuous review. And that was done by looking at our retention and expansion metrics. And this is going back to Twilio. We really, we had different products in different markets. And so we were always looking at, how our products, did they do, in Asia, Europe, US, what are the expansion rates? What are the churn rates? We also looked at by customer size. And if anything was off, again, that's backward looking, but you can be quick, we'd modify it. And so most of our pricing modifications at Twilio were outside of the US. We were always reviewing it also on a formal basis. We didn't make too many changes at a high level. And we just wanted, we had a model, we were investing a lot more in terms of R&D, in security and data privacy than our competition. We were a slight premium to our competitors. So we were always taking a close look to say, hey, can we continue to command that premium? But there were not a lot of changes. And you don't want to change it unless you really have to.
Makes sense. Okay, follow up on that question. Brian asks, did you ever modify prices on signed contracts that were enforced? In other words, like 6 months into a contract, did you ever modify pricing?
I'm not sure I understand the side contract component.
Twilio signed a customer up, and then 6 months later they're unhappy with the contract. Did you modify the pricing?
I can't think. If we were to have done it, I can't think of many examples. If the sales rep oversold something, or we found out that fact, and unfortunately that did not happen very often, but I was there 7 years and there was a lot of customers, but no, we felt pretty good about the product and the offering and stuck with it.
Makes sense. Okay. Jason asked this question. So you had the sales team and then you got the customer success or the account management team. Did the account management team was responsible for the expansion of the account? Did that AM team, the account management team, did they roll up to a customer success team, or was that by definition the customer success org?
In our structure, the account management team was in fact by itself, and we did have customer success can mean a lot of different things, but the account management team reported into the head of sales. So now we had a customer success team that worked with our smaller customers going forward. So that customer success team worked with our small customers. But by definition, it was almost a customer size standpoint, but they did work closely together.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm just sifting through the questions here. Did your sales cycles increase through the life of the company as you moved up market? Is a great question from VJ.
Yes, it did. Yeah. So as we at Twilio had a model where we had our usage APIs, and what also was great on the Twilio developer model was, think of Twilio as Legos, right? So they're building blocks. We would watch people build things with Legos, and we'd say, hey, why don't we build that for you? So it was a higher level use case going forward. But as Twilio got into the customer support space with this Twilio Flex offering, going in and selling in, good sized call contact centers, definitely a very different sales cycle than bringing a developer on board at a startup.
Makes sense. Yeah. Was that tough to go? I mean, you were selling infrastructure for a long time, and then you added software, right? Did you have to retrain the account executives at all? Was it a different motion, or was it really just an expansion of something that was
we had been doing it. We had been doing enterprise sales before, not, to be blunt, not very well. We brought in George Hu had been COO at Salesforce, who was just a terrific colleague and all that. And he brought in that playbook, and we of course had our usage-based playbook, and he was smart enough to figure out how to pull those two together. So that was a great example. I mean, we realized we were ready to bring someone else in. We didn't have that capability as we started these higher level offerings. So that's where we brought in the outside expertise to drive it.
Makes sense. Okay. Fantastic. All right. Well, I think we're at time here. Lee, I want to thank you so much. This has been incredibly insightful. We covered two super important topics: usage-based pricing, market transitions. I learned a lot. The 3 points that I took out, one was, if you can raise in order to maintain your growth rate, even if it means more dilution, absolutely do that. The second is, the goal of usage-based pricing is to align your success as a business with your customer's success. And then the last is, make sure that you prepare yourself for when the recovery comes, that your compensation structure is strong so that you retain your most important employees. Those are absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for attending office hours, everybody. Really appreciate your questions. Look forward to our next one. We'll have Lars Nilsson, the VP of Global Sales Development at Snowflake, coming to you in a couple weeks. Lee, thank you so much again. It's been hugely insightful. Really appreciate the time.
Great. You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.